If we avoid a recession, we can thank Black and Hispanic workers. The U.S. labor market is on a gravity-defying streak. The June jobs report was a tad softer than expected, but the overall trend is so strong that recession fears are fading. Hiring remains solid across many industries, including construction, and companies are largely holding on to their workers. There's growing optimism that the country can avoid a downturn. One key reason this is possible is the surge of new workers. Nearly 4 million more people are employed now than just before the pandemic hit. That's more families with steady incomes to spend, which helps explain the vigorous sales of everything from cars to gardening supplies. There has also been a big upshift in the labor force since the pandemic. Low-paying hospitality employment still hasn't recovered, as workers have traded up to higher-paying business, healthcare, and warehouse work. This has brought another boost to incomes and an important mental shift as more workers who used to hop from job to job now see themselves on a steady career path. The mistaken notion that Americans don't want to work can now be put to rest. Nearly 81% of Americans ages 25 to 54 are working, the highest share since 2001. What has been particularly jaw-dropping is how resilient job gains have been since March 2022, when the Federal Reserve started aggressively hiking interest rates. Back then, Fed Chair Jerome H. Powell argued the labor market was unhealthy. There was a misguided belief that it would take a recession to get supply and demand for goods, and workers, back to more normal levels. But what many experts missed was how many workers of color and immigrants wanted to work and were still looking for opportunities. Fewer white people are employed now than pre-pandemic. In contrast, over 2 million more Hispanics are employed now, over 800,000 more Asian Americans and over 750,000 more African Americans. This same trend played out just before the pandemic. Companies were also complaining then that they could not find workers, and experts were saying the nation was at full employment. Yet month after month, Black and Hispanic people, largely women, kept entering the labor force and getting jobs. It's also notable that over 2 million more foreign-born people are employed now than before the pandemic. This means that more than half of the new workers have been immigrants. If the U.S. economy ends up having a soft landing, it will largely be because immigrants and people of color have kept entering the labor force, helping to keep production going, consumption solid and wage growth, and inflation, cooling to a more sustainable level. What's going on is partly a result of low unemployment, what economists often dub a tight labor market. Black and Hispanic people often do not get hired until late in a recovery. In the past year, there has also been a strong uptick in jobs in government and healthcare, sectors in which women of color have historically found employment opportunities. Employers have also expanded their hiring searches, improved pay and benefits, and removed requirements for college degrees for many positions. All of this has helped expand opportunities. This past spring, for the first time, Black Americans were as likely to be employed as white Americans. There is sufficient demand that employers aren't discriminating. They need workers, economist William Spriggs told me in a conversation shortly before his death last month. Spriggs spent years pointing out that too many experts were overlooking how many more people of color were ready to work if only employers would give them a chance and the jobs weren't dead-end ones. As other economists were stunned by the labor market in recent months, especially the gains for Black people, Spriggs had a different take. It's not that the labor market is overheated, he said. It's that the labor market is getting closer to how it's supposed to work in a textbook. All of this suggests experts still don't fully understand what full employment is or how much more labor supply is out there. Policymakers have spent significant time trying to understand why so many white men no longer work. Their labor force participation has been declining for 70 years. It's still important to look for ways to stop that, but policymakers also need to look at how to get more women, especially women of color, working. Women have already demonstrated, time and again, that they want to work more. The U.S. labor force is more diverse today than ever. As baby boomers retire, they are being replaced by younger workers, especially workers of color. Non-white people now make up more than 40% of the labor force. That's almost double the 1990 level. There has been a steady rise in workers of color as the American population has diversified, but the workforce trend accelerated somewhat during the pandemic. No one wants to see the gains for Black and Hispanic workers backtrack. But it's equally important to ask, how many more people could find jobs? And why aren't policymakers trying to find out? If we avoid a recession, we can thank Black and Hispanic workers. The U.S. labor market is on a gravity-defying streak. The June jobs report was a tad softer than expected, but the overall trend is so strong that recession fears are fading. Hiring remains solid across many industries, including construction, and companies are largely holding on to their workers. There's growing optimism that the country can avoid the America trap. Why our enemies often underestimate U.S. How quickly do times of apparent peace become times of conflict, seemingly stable world orders come crashing down, the hopes of many for improvement of the human condition are dashed and replaced by fear and despair. For the first dozen years after World War I, the three powerful democracies, the United States, Britain and France, were in substantial control of world affairs, economically, politically and militarily. They established the terms of the peace settlement, redrew the borders of Europe, summoned new nations into being, distributed pieces of defunct empires, erected security arrangements, determined who owed what to whom, and how and when debts should be paid. They called together the conferences that determined the levels of armaments the major nations could possess. All this was possible because they had won the war, because the United States and Britain controlled the banks and the seas, because France wielded predominant military power on the European continent. With this power, the three Western democracies sought to establish and consolidate a world system favorable to their interests and preferences. They argued over how best to do this, and they became increasingly estranged from each other in these years. But they all wanted a stable, prosperous and peaceful Europe. They all sought to preserve their global empires, or, in the United States case, its hemispheric hegemony. They all sought to defend the liberal, capitalist economic system that enriched and protected them and in which they believed. None doubted the rightness of their vision of international order or much questioned the justice of imposing it. And there had been successes, certainly from their point of view. By the second half of the 1920s, the world had grown less violent and marginally less miserable. In Europe especially, economies were recovering, living standards were rising, general violence was down from the immediate post-war years, and the dangers of war and aggression seemed as low as they had been in decades. Internationally, trade had risen by more than 20%, despite growing protectionism, driven largely by the American economic boom. Nations spent more time discussing measures for peace than preparing for war. The League of Nations